Long before European explorers crossed the Atlantic, before the United States existed, and even before many of Europe's greatest kingdoms rose to power, an ancient people had already built thriving communities atop the towering mesas of the American Southwest. Their story stretches back more than 1,000 years, making them one of the oldest continuously living cultures in North America. They are the Hopi. High above the desert floor of what is now northeastern Arizona stand three isolated sandstone mesas. At first glance, they seem like ordinary cliffs rising from an endless landscape of red rock and sagebrush. Yet for centuries these mesas have been home to a people whose traditions, ceremonies, and beliefs have survived wars, colonization, droughts, and dramatic social change. The Hopi call themselves Hapatu Shernumu, often translated as the peaceful people or the people who live in the correct way. Their history is not simply a story of survival. It is a story of adaptation, resilience, and an enduring spiritual connection to the land. Unlike many civilizations whose histories are preserved mainly in written records, the Hopi have passed much of their history through oral tradition. Elders, storytellers, and ceremonial leaders have carried these stories from one generation to the next. Archaeology, linguistics, and anthropology complement these traditions, helping historians piece together the remarkable journey of the Hopi people. Ancient ancestors. The story begins more than 2,000 years ago with the ancient peoples archaeologists refer to as the Ancestral Puebloans, once known as the Anasazi. While the older term Anasazi appears in historical literature, many indigenous communities prefer Ancestral Puebloans because it is considered more respectful. Beginning around 500 CE, these ancestors developed sophisticated villages throughout the Four Corners region, where present-day Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, and Utah meet. They were master builders, constructing homes from carefully shaped sandstone blocks and adobe mortar. Some of their greatest achievements remain standing today. Massive cliff dwellings were carved into canyon walls. Multi-story apartment-like buildings housed hundreds of people. Underground ceremonial chambers known as kivas served as places of worship, community meetings, and sacred rituals. These communities flourished for centuries. The people cultivated corn, beans, squash, and cotton in one of the driest environments in North America. Without modern irrigation systems, they mastered dry farming, learning to conserve every drop of rainfall. Their understanding of weather, soil, and seasonal cycles allowed agriculture to thrive where outsiders believed it impossible. Trade networks connected them with distant cultures. Turquoise traveled hundreds of miles. Macaw feathers arrived from what is now Mexico. Shell jewelry came from the Pacific coast. These exchanges reveal a sophisticated civilization linked across much of the American Southwest. A time of change. Around the late 1200s, life began to change dramatically. Years of severe drought struck the Southwest. Water sources dried up. Crop failures became increasingly common. Environmental pressures were only part of the challenge. Competition for resources increased. Some communities experienced conflict, while others gradually abandoned their homes in search of safer places. One by one, the magnificent cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, and other great centers were left behind. For many years, historians debated what caused these migrations. Today, researchers generally agree that no single event explains the movement. Instead, climate change, resource shortages, shifting trade routes, social tensions, and spiritual beliefs all likely influenced the decision to relocate. Rather than disappearing, these people carried their traditions with them. Among those descendants were the ancestors of today's Hopi. The journey to the mesas. According to Hopi oral traditions, different clans traveled across vast landscapes before eventually settling on the mesas of northern Arizona. These migrations were deeply spiritual. Each clan followed sacred instructions, searching for signs that would reveal where they should live. Some stories describe footprints in stone, unusual rock formations, or other natural landmarks confirming that they had reached their destined home. As clans met during their journeys, they formed alliances. Some brought specialized knowledge of farming. Others were skilled hunters. Still others carried unique ceremonial responsibilities. Instead of creating one large kingdom under a single ruler, these clans established independent villages connected by shared beliefs, mutual cooperation, and ceremonial obligations. This decentralized structure became one of the defining features of Hopi society. Building the villages. By approximately 1100 to 1300 CE, permanent settlements appeared atop the mesas. The location was ideal. Steep cliffs made attacks more difficult. The high elevation provided cooler temperatures during summer. Nearby valleys offered farmland. The villages themselves reflected remarkable engineering. Homes were built from sandstone blocks, plastered with mud, and arranged in multi-story complexes. Families often entered upper floors using ladders. Ground-level entrances were rare, making villages easier to defend during times of conflict. Inside each home, daily life centered around family. Women ground corn using stone metates. Men farmed, hunted, and participated in construction. Children learned practical skills by observing their parents and grandparents. Community cooperation was essential. Large construction projects required many workers. Harvests depended on shared labor. Ceremonies involved every generation. Every person contributed to village life. Corn, the gift of life. No crop held greater importance than corn. To outsiders, corn might appear to be simply another agricultural product. For the Hopi, it represented life itself. Corn nourished the body. It also nourished the spirit. Different colors of corn symbolized different directions, ceremonies, and aspects of creation. Corn pollen became one of the most sacred offerings in Hopi religious life. Even today, corn remains central to many ceremonies. Generations of Hopi farmers developed extraordinary techniques for growing corn without irrigation. Seeds were planted deep beneath the surface, where moisture remained after seasonal rains. Fields were carefully chosen to maximize rainfall runoff. Knowledge of weather patterns was passed from parent to child over centuries. This expertise allowed communities to survive in one of North America's harshest climates. Society without kings. Unlike many civilizations of the ancient world, the Hopi did not build vast empires ruled by powerful kings. Authority was shared among clan leaders, village chiefs, and religious societies. Important decisions often required discussion and consensus. Leadership depended less on military strength and more on wisdom, experience, and spiritual responsibility. Clans formed the foundation of society. Membership passed through the mother's family. Children belonged to their mother's clan, inherited property through her lineage, and maintained strong relationships with maternal relatives. This matrilineal system shaped nearly every aspect of Hopi social organization. Marriage often brought husbands into the household of their wives, strengthening clan connections across villages. Living in harmony. Perhaps the most enduring principle of Hopi culture is the pursuit of harmony. People sought balance with nature, with one another, and with the spiritual world. The changing seasons were understood not simply as weather, but as part of a sacred cycle connecting humans, plants, animals, and supernatural beings. Ceremonies reinforced these relationships throughout the year. Songs, dances, prayers, and rituals expressed gratitude for rain, successful harvests, and the continued well-being of the community. These traditions would become essential to Hopi identity, helping preserve their culture through centuries of tremendous change. Yet an even greater challenge lay ahead. Far beyond the deserts of Arizona, European kingdoms were expanding across the Atlantic Ocean. Within a few generations, strangers wearing steel armor and carrying horses, firearms, and unfamiliar religions would arrive in the Southwest. Their arrival would forever alter the history of the Hopi people. To be continued, the Hopi people had lived on their mesas for centuries before Europeans arrived. Their villages overlooked vast deserts. Their fields produced crops despite the harsh climate, and their ceremonies marked the changing seasons with songs, dances, and prayers. To the Hopi, the world was held together through balance between people, nature, and the spiritual forces that governed life. But in the 16th century, that balance would be challenged by newcomers from across the ocean. A spiritual world. Before examining the arrival of Europeans, it is important to understand the beliefs that shaped Hopi society. The Hopi viewed the universe as a living system in which every person, animal, plant, mountain, and cloud had a purpose. Life was not divided into the sacred and the ordinary. Farming, family life, hunting, and ceremonies were all connected through spiritual responsibility. According to Hopi tradition, humanity had passed through several previous worlds before entering the present one. Different oral traditions describe these worlds in slightly different ways, but they all emphasize that people survived by living humbly and following spiritual teachings. When greed, violence, or corruption became widespread, those earlier worlds ended, and faithful people were guided into a new beginning. These stories were not simply myths in the modern sense. They formed the moral foundation of Hopi society and taught each generation how people should live. The Katsanam. One of the best-known aspects of Hopi religion is the belief in Katsanam, often spelled Kachinas in English. Katsanam are spiritual beings associated with natural forces, ancestors, clouds, rain, mountains, animals, and other elements of creation. They are not worshipped as gods. Instead, they serve as powerful spiritual messengers connecting the physical world with the Creator. Throughout the ceremonial calendar, members of religious societies perform masked dances representing various Katsanam. To outsiders, these dancers may appear to be performers wearing elaborate costumes. For the Hopi, however, the ceremonies are sacred acts meant to renew harmony, encourage rainfall, strengthen the community, and teach important lessons. Children also receive beautifully carved wooden Katsina dolls. These are not toys or idols. They are teaching tools that help young people learn about different spiritual beings and the values they represent. Each carving is unique, reflecting generations of artistic skill and religious knowledge. Life on the mesas. Life demanded cooperation. The mesas offered security but also required careful planning. Water was scarce. Fields often lay several miles away from the villages. Every family contributed to survival. Before sunrise, farmers left for their fields carrying digging sticks, seeds, and food for the day. They watched the sky constantly, hoping for summer rains that would determine whether crops survived. Women played a central role in family and community life. They owned many homes through the matrilineal clan system. They ground corn into meal, prepared food, raised children, created pottery, and maintained household traditions passed down over countless generations. Pottery became one of the Hopi's greatest artistic achievements. Using locally gathered clay, skilled artisans created bowls, jars, and ceremonial vessels decorated with geometric designs inspired by birds, clouds, feathers, and flowing water. These works were both practical and beautiful. Many museums around the world now display Hopi pottery as masterpieces of Native American art. Trade across the Southwest. Although the Hopi villages appeared isolated, they were part of an extensive trading network. Merchants traveled hundreds of miles across deserts and mountains. The Hopi exchanged woven cotton textiles, pottery, agricultural products, and turquoise for shells from California, copper from distant regions, colorful feathers, salt, and other valuable goods. Trade also spread ideas. Religious traditions, artistic techniques, farming knowledge, and stories traveled with merchants between many indigenous nations of the Southwest. Long before European explorers arrived, these societies maintained complex relationships through diplomacy and commerce. The first Europeans. Everything changed in 1540. Spanish explorer Francisco Vasquez de Coronado entered the American Southwest while searching for the legendary 7 cities of gold. Spanish leaders had heard stories of wealthy cities filled with unimaginable riches. Instead of golden palaces, Coronado's expedition encountered thriving indigenous communities built from stone and adobe. Although Coronado himself likely never visited every Hopi village, members of his expedition reached the Hopi mesas. The visitors found organized settlements, productive farms, and people who had successfully adapted to one of North America's harshest landscapes. The Hopi, in turn, saw something entirely unfamiliar. The newcomers rode horses. They carried steel swords and firearms. Their armor reflected the desert sun like polished mirrors. For many Hopi, it was their first encounter with Europeans. Missionaries arrived. Spanish interest in the region continued after Coronado's expedition ended. By the early 17th century, Franciscan missionaries established churches in several Pueblo communities. Their goal was clear. They hoped to convert indigenous peoples to Christianity. Some missionaries sincerely believed they were saving souls. Others worked closely with Spanish colonial authorities to strengthen imperial control. Churches were built. Christian teachings spread. Traditional ceremonies were discouraged, or openly forbidden. Sacred objects were destroyed in some communities. Religious leaders faced increasing pressure to abandon long-standing beliefs. The Hopi accepted certain aspects of European technology, including livestock and some metal tools. However, they strongly resisted efforts to replace their religious traditions. Unlike some neighboring communities where Spanish influence became stronger, many Hopi villages remained determined to preserve their own ceremonies and beliefs. Tensions rise. Spanish colonial rule brought additional burdens. Indigenous communities were expected to provide labor. Tribute payments increased. Disease spread through the Southwest. European illnesses such as smallpox devastated native populations who had no natural immunity. Entire villages across the region suffered catastrophic losses. Although exact numbers for the Hopi are uncertain, epidemics reduced populations and disrupted community life. The combination of disease, forced labor, religious suppression, and colonial demands created growing resentment. Across the Pueblo world, resistance slowly intensified. The Pueblo Revolt of 1680. In 1680, one of the most successful indigenous uprisings in North American history began. The movement united many Pueblo communities under the leadership of Pope, a religious leader from Oconjo in present-day New Mexico. Messengers carried knotted cords from village to village. Each day, one knot was untied. By the 19th century, Spanish rule had faded, Mexico had gained independence, and the United States was rapidly extending its borders across North America. A new chapter in Hopi history, and a new set of challenges, was about to begin. To be continued. By the early 19th century, the Spanish Empire had faded from the American Southwest. Mexico briefly governed the region after gaining independence in 1821, but another powerful nation was already expanding westward. The United States, driven by the belief in manifest destiny, sought to extend its territory from the Atlantic to the Pacific. For the Hopi people, this new era would bring profound changes, testing their ability to preserve their identity while adapting to an increasingly interconnected world. A new government arrives. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ended the Mexican-American War. Under the treaty, Mexico ceded a vast portion of its northern territories to the United States, including what is now Arizona. For the Hopi, no one had asked whether they wished to become part of another nation. The mesas remained the same. The ceremonies continued. Corn still grew in carefully tended fields. Yet the political world around them had changed overnight. American soldiers, surveyors, missionaries, traders, and settlers gradually entered the Southwest. Although the Hopi villages remained relatively isolated, federal officials increasingly viewed native nations as communities that should be brought under U.S. authority. Establishing the Hopi Reservation. In the late 19th century, the U.S. government created reservations across the West to define where native peoples would live. In 1882, President Chester A. Arthur established the Hopi Reservation by executive order. The reservation covered only a small portion of the land that the Hopi traditionally used for farming, hunting, gathering plants, and conducting ceremonies. Although it recognized the Hopi's presence, it did not restore the full extent of their ancestral homeland. Complicating matters further, the Hopi Reservation was surrounded almost entirely by the much larger Navajo Reservation. For generations, Hopi and Navajo communities had lived near one another, trading, cooperating, and at times competing for resources. Their histories were long and complex. As federal boundaries were imposed, disputes over land use became increasingly difficult. Rather than following traditional patterns of shared access and seasonal movement, the U.S. government attempted to define ownership using fixed borders. These policies contributed to decades of legal and political conflict that continued well into the 20th century. The boarding school era. Perhaps no federal policy affected Native communities more deeply than the boarding school system. Beginning in the late 19th century, the U.S. government sought to assimilate Native American children into mainstream American society. Officials believed that indigenous cultures should be replaced with Euro-American customs, languages, and religions. Thousands of Native children from many different nations, including Hopi children, were sent to government or church-run boarding schools. Some attended schools hundreds of miles from home. Upon arrival, many experienced dramatic changes. Traditional clothing was replaced with uniforms. Long hair was cut short. Students were often forbidden from speaking their native languages. Ceremonies and cultural practices were discouraged or punished. The goal was not simply education. It was cultural assimilation. Many former students later described feelings of loneliness, homesickness, and cultural loss. Others remembered teachers who genuinely cared about them while still participating in a system designed to reshape native identities. The boarding school era remains a painful chapter in the history of many indigenous nations. Despite these pressures, Hopi families continued to preserve their language and traditions whenever possible. Elders remained essential teachers. Stories continued to be shared. Ceremonies continued to be held. Culture survived because each generation chose to protect it. The Hopi tribal government. As federal Indian policy evolved during the 20th century, Native nations gained greater opportunities for self-government. In 1936, under the Indian Reorganization Act, the Hopi adopted a written constitution and established the modern Hopi Tribal Council. The council became responsible for many governmental functions, including relations with the federal government, economic planning, education, and natural resource management. At the same time, traditional village governments and religious leaders continued to play important roles. This created a unique balance. Modern elected institutions handled many political matters, while ancient ceremonial traditions remained central to community life. The coexistence of these systems reflected the Hopi commitment to maintaining continuity with the past while responding to modern challenges. Protecting sacred lands. Throughout the 20th century, disputes over land remained one of the Hopi Nation's greatest concerns. Questions about grazing rights, mineral resources, and reservation boundaries frequently reached federal courts. One particularly controversial issue involved coal mining on Black Mesa. Beginning in the 1960s, energy companies developed large mining operations in parts of the region. Supporters argued that mining created jobs and generated revenue. Critics raised concerns about environmental impacts, especially the use of groundwater from ancient aquifers. For the Hopi, water is far more than a natural resource. It holds profound spiritual significance. Protecting springs, aquifers, and sacred landscapes became an important priority for many community members. These debates highlighted the difficult balance between economic development and cultural preservation. Preserving language and culture. Today, the Hopi language remains one of the oldest continuously spoken indigenous languages in North America. However, like many native languages, it faces challenges. English dominates education, media, and business. Fewer children grow up speaking Hopi fluently than in previous generations. To address this, schools, cultural organizations, and elders have developed language revitalization programs. Children learn traditional songs. Community members record oral histories. Digital archives preserve stories for future generations. Language classes help young people reconnect with their heritage. Each new speaker strengthens the future of Hopi culture. Art that carries history. Hopi artistic traditions continue to flourish. Pottery remains internationally admired for its elegant designs and exceptional craftsmanship. Silversmiths create jewelry featuring symbols rooted in generations of tradition. Basket weaving continues using techniques refined over centuries. Perhaps the most recognized works are the carved katsina dolls. Originally created as educational objects for children, these carvings have also become highly respected works of art. Collectors around the world admire their craftsmanship. For the Hopi, however, their deeper significance lies in the cultural knowledge they represent. Each carving tells part of a much larger story. Ceremonies continue. Although many ceremonies remain private, they continue to define the rhythm of Hopi life. Throughout the year, religious societies perform dances and rituals connected to planting, rainfall, harvests, and spiritual renewal. Visitors are welcome at some public ceremonies, but photography, recording, and disruptive behavior are generally prohibited. These customs help protect traditions that have survived for centuries. Respect from visitors is considered an important part of preserving Hopi cultural heritage. The Hopi Nation today. Today, the Hopi Reservation is home to approximately 12,000 enrolled tribal members, though not all live on the reservation. Many Hopi people work in education, healthcare, government, business, agriculture, the arts, and environmental conservation. Others serve in the United States military or pursue careers across the country while maintaining strong connections to their communities. Modern technology exists alongside ancient traditions. Children use computers in school while learning stories from their grandparents. Families drive trucks to fields where farming methods still reflect centuries of accumulated knowledge. Solar panels stand not far from villages first established during the Middle Ages. This blending of old and new demonstrates that indigenous cultures are not frozen in time. They continue to evolve while preserving their identity. An enduring legacy. The story of the Hopi people is remarkable not because they remained unchanged, but because they adapted without losing the foundations of who they are. For more than 1,000 years, they have endured droughts, migrations, colonial empires, disease, political upheaval, forced assimilation, and rapid technological change. Through each challenge, they preserved a language, a worldview, and ceremonial traditions that reach deep into North America's ancient past. Their mesas still rise above the Arizona desert. Their corn still grows in dry fields carefully tended by skilled farmers. Their songs still echo during ceremonies marking the changing seasons. And their history continues, not as a relic of the past, but as a living story carried forward by each new generation. The history of the Hopi people is ultimately a story of resilience, a reminder that cultures can endure not only through strength, but through wisdom, community, and an unwavering commitment to remembering who